Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
And I'm Emily Ann Garcia, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
In this episode, we'll discuss Transfiguration Sunday, also known as the last Sunday of Epiphany, which this year falls on February 14th. One content notification for this episode. In our conversation on the second reading, we talk about Paul's use of ableist language and Paul's use of light and dark imagery and the ways that it has racist connotations today.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
Today, for our deep dive, we have our special guest, Emily Ann Garcia. Emily is an artist focusing mainly on photography and fluid art. She is also co-chair of the Board of Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries. These are just two of the many ways Emily is a nerd. Emily, you and I were talking a while ago now, a month, a decade? I have no idea. Time has no meaning. About a particular controversy in the art world around black paint or pigment. What is the deal with black paint? Is black not just black?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there's a couple background pieces that it's useful to understand before getting into the dramatic details of the art world controversy. And one of them is just to understand a little bit more about black pigment and paint and what it actually is and how it interacts with us as people who are seeing it. And that's that basically when you look at anything that's a color, and we're talking mostly here about not looking at light, but you're looking at some other physical object. The color that you're seeing is what is is the light being reflected back at you. So when we have, this is obviously a very overview flattening of a lot of details. So you can go down some pretty interesting YouTube paths about this and YouTube holes about this if you're interested in more details. But that basically, if you're looking at something that's yellow, you're having the full spectrum of visible color of light being reflected off of that object, and what's being reflected back at you is the yellow wavelength, and so your eyes and your brain perceive that object as yellow. So when it comes to things that are white, you're looking at a thing that is reflecting the full spectrum back at you, and you're seeing that object as white. For things that are black, what's actually happening is that you're having basically nothing is being reflected back at you. That's a real flattening of the understanding, but whatever's actually happening there in terms of pigment is absorbing all the different colors in the light spectrum. So that being said, not all blacks are exactly the same as each other in terms of pigment or paint or dyes, anything that's making an object black. And you can tell that based on the fact that lots of people have the experience of going to their closet and trying to match a black shirt with black pants, and it's like, these are not the same color.
Oh, no.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that happens because of the sort of oversimplification of the concept of black. Many artists end up mixing their own black rather than buying something that's like a pre-mixed black concept. And I know you are one of them, Emily.
Yeah, in art class in high school, our art teacher would not let us use pre-made black. We always had to mix our blacks. And so I have always mixed my blacks.
Yeah, and so a lot of artists do that because it creates a much sort of richer experience and is what is usually colloquially referred to as a more natural black. A sort of really pure black color isn't very often found in a natural setting. When you're painting something and you're wanting to give it a more natural look, usually there's not a lot of times that there actually is something that's like pure black. It's usually very dark blue, or it's a very rich and deep green that you would still perceive as black, but does have a little bit more depth and other color that's in there. And so that's part of why people often end up mixing their own blacks. So that's a little bit of background about some things about black and black pigment. And so the piece of it that had come up in a conversation that we had, however long ago that was, Emily, was a project that came out. It was in the early, it's like 2014, when there was a new kind of black pigment and paint that was developed that was called Vantablack. And it was known as basically the blackest black in the world. And it was developed in lab conditions and is actually really hard for it to be stable outside of lab conditions. However, you can learn all kinds of things about it on Wikipedia. It involves nanotubes and is fairly interesting to learn about. But for the purpose of this conversation, the experience of seeing something that's been painted with Vantablack is really fascinating because it absorbs so much light and has a method using the nanotubes of absorbing so much light that you actually can't perceive the shape of whatever it is that's painted. So yeah, Whoa. If you look at the Wikipedia article about it, they do an example of having crumpled up aluminum foil that you can see the edges of it are all crumpled up. But the part that is still wrinkled but painted with Vantablack, you cannot see the wrinkles of it. It does such a thorough job of absorbing all the light that you are unable to perceive the shape. And that's true about other three-dimensional shapes. There's been lots of stuff that's been done about painting a sphere or painting other shapes, and it's just not possible to perceive the shape, which is a fascinating experience because you think of things that you see in the world as, yeah, that's a really dark black color, but you still are getting some amount of light reflection off of it that helps the other parts of your brain understand what it is you're looking at. And in this case, you can't. So that's sort of the background of what happened when that was initially created. The controversy came in when a British artist, Anish Kapoor, worked with
Sir.
Of course,
Anish
yes,
Kapoor,
Sir
right?
Anish Kapoor, who is a British artist.
You just gotta
sure, absolutely. And this story is about ego. He managed to successfully exclusively license Vantablack for his own art projects and installations. So
what does that
basically means that for art purposes, he's the only one that's allowed to use it. There have been some other projects that it has been licensed to be used for that are more about either science projects or other manufacturing kind of things, but from an art perspective, he's the only person that's allowed to use it.
I don't remember which article I was reading about it, but I think I read somewhere that the way that he got the lab's attention was that he used Vantablack to paint a big black circle on a floor somewhere, and it looked like Wile E. Coyote trying to, lure the Roadrunner into the black hole. And that was the thing that got their attention, and they decided to license it.
Yeah, so I don't think, my guess is that the company did not realize what kerfuffle was going to arise. Arise in the art world about this. And from my perspective, I don't think the company who was developing it actually didn't really get a lot of negative attention from the thing. It's really that Anish Kapoor got the negative attention.
I was just going to say, was the company that was developing the pigment, were they developing it for art, or were they developing it for science and it just happened?
Yeah, they were definitely developing it for science, and it's only somewhat useful from an art perspective because it really has to be both created and applied and even then housed and viewed in very specific conditions. At least that's how it started. I'm not sure if they've developed, Vantablack 2.0 or something that, is a little bit more stable, but he has said many words that a person can find to defend himself. I won't bother giving airtime to those things. But the part that sort of became interesting after that is that there's a lot of fellow artists who thought that this was a pretty abhorrent choice to make, that having the kind of thing that happens, to have something so unique and so interesting become available in the world, and then to be but I'm the only one that's allowed to use it. No one else is allowed to. So there's quite a lot of pushback about that. And a particular artist, another British artist named Stuart Semple, then really started developing his own product lines. So he's done a few different things that have been pretty interesting, and one of them is that he's developed other black pigments that are also a much deeper black that can't quite be called the blackest black, but are for most people's purposes, equivalent. The kind of thing that a person is likely to do with them is, especially a normal everyday human that might be interested in super black paint, it's not going to be, it's actually like very stable. It's just regular acrylic paint, but just happens to be a particularly rich black. And he sells those things for a much more reasonable cost. But one of the funny things about it, he's also developed a few other things like the pinkest pink and the shiniest shiny and
the shiniest
there's
shiny?
a bunch of different ones that are like, there's one that's based on unicorns that's like about like the most iridescent or something like that. It's like sort of his whole shtick, and
that's fantastic.
Yeah,
mostest.
And they're definitely, you know, pricier than what you would probably pay at your like local corner craft store or whatever, but from a perspective of like high quality art paint, it's quite affordable. Yeah, so if you are interested in those kinds of things, you should definitely go seek out that information. But part of what was really funny about his choices and the way he was really pushing back on the Anish Kapoor controversy is that if you go to his website and try to buy his products, he is very clear that they're made for everybody at every walk of life, regardless of what level of artist you are or anything. But it says, by adding this product to your cart, you confirm that you are not Anish Kapoor. You are in no way affiliated with Anish Kapoor, and you are not purchasing this item on behalf of Anish Kapoor or an associate of Anish Kapoor. To the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, this paint will not make its way into the hands of Anish Kapoor.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I did love that. And I believe he's actually still using the hashtag share the black to poke fun at Anish Kapoor on a fairly regular basis. But if you're interested in looking that up, I saw that for pinkest pink, at least, it's about $6 for 50 grams of the powdered paint, which you then mix with various oils or water or whatever or epoxy resin, apparently, to use. And I guess his stuff does get good reviews, it looks like, on the website. So, Emily Ann, can you think of any fun Valentine's Day themed projects people who aren't Anish Kapoor anyway might want to do with Pinkest Pink or any of Stuart Semple's other?
I mean, I could think of great things with the second blackest black or whatever. Also for Valentine's Day as a single person.
Yeah,
I'm just saying.
that's definitely my first reaction too. I'm not, that big into the Valentine's Day hearts and stuff. So I'm like, ooh, let's, paint everything in a sort of moody tone and do something in that regard. I do a lot of fluid art, so I do a lot of like acrylic pour painting and things like that, and it does make me wonder. I haven't actually ever purchased the stuff, although as I was thinking about and preparing for this conversation with you folks, I was thinking about like, what would that be like to do some pour painting with that kind of blackest black or very close to blackest black.
It would also probably look really cool to do blackest black and pinkest pink. Like,
yes, that would be a great
combination. That would be it.
Well, it's certainly true that one of the things that people often find, or what's true about what the sort of craft level paint that you could buy at the dollar store versus the art level paint that costs a lot more per bottle or whatever, is often that there's just so much more pigment per medium, essentially, in the more expensive paint. And so when I'm working with my fluid techniques, I'm essentially diluting that amount of pigment anyway, because I'm mixing it with other stuff to make the medium thinner so that it's more pourable. So I'm not sure what that would actually end up meaning for a pinkest pink or a blackest black, if that would really over dilute the purpose of the whole gambit.
Yeah, I am not necessarily a very pink person myself, but I was kind of amused by the thought of taking Anish Kapoor's first use of Vantablack and, trying to make a pink hole instead of a black hole on your floor with it. And what would it be like to travel through one of those? I think pretty psychedelic.
I guess the other thing that's funny about imagining doing a Valentine's Day project with a pinkest pink is sort of one of the things that is lovely about Valentine's Day is it's a day that people are like sort of allowed to be a little bit more like mushy and over the top than is normally sanctioned in everyday life. And so the idea of being like, today my mushiness for my beloved friends and family and partners is coming out in the pinkest pink. It's not that I love you just the normal amount of pink, but I love you the pinkest pink.
You can make it the most iridescent pinkest pink.
Try to get all those honors. Yeah.
All the mostests. Yeah, that's hilarious. I'm also now like curious about this iridescent because what does that even look like? Like, what is it? Just like if you put the iridescent on the pinkest pink, what happens? Or what if you do it on the blackest black? Do they like somehow counteract each other some?
Yeah, if you look at the website, Stuart Semple's website, where you can buy this stuff, it's culturehustle.com. There is actually some examples of the thing that I was talking about is called unicorn milk. And there are...
Unicorn milk?
Yep. And there are some examples there of it actually being over the current... I mean, a bunch of his current colors that he sells, but including the current most black color.
Interesting.
Yep.
I'm going to have to go look it up. And we'll include a link to that in our episode description.
Great.
Shifting gears a little bit.
Sure.
But only kind of, because all of this is all still arty.
Yes.
Emily, you do a lot of photography. And as I mentioned, you're a co-chair of the board of Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries. So you're pretty churchy and pretty queer within that churchiness. So I'm curious if there are particular things you think about or imagine when you read the Bible or hear the Bible read in worship or something like that. Like, are there things that you find yourself drawn to or ways that it grabs your attention that you think about and you're like, oh, this is like because I'm an arty person, or like...
I think that for me, because I think mostly about my photography pieces, I really think of stories and stuff in images and frames. So I really am like usually thinking about the particular view of the angle of like what's being seen and what's being described. And then therefore I think that ends up often causing me to wonder about what the angle is that isn't being articulated. Because that's a thing that is often true about me when I'm doing photography, especially of events. There's usually some expected things that people want to see in the wedding photography or the other event photography. And of course, I want to make sure that those images exist for people. But I'm also looking for the stuff that nobody else is noticing. The places that I can get a slightly different angle. I can climb up on top of something or duck down under something to try to get a slightly different view to give the whole picture of the event more depth and nuance. And so I do think that is a particular experience that I often bring to listening to stories, biblical or otherwise.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, and you did a photography project.
I've done a few.
Like worship. Well, yes, but like with the Revised Common Lectionary.
Oh yeah,
like bulletins or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did for the ELCIC. They every year. I mean, historically,
the ELCIC, for those who don't know, is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada.
Oh yes, I do live in Canada.
Hey, we're an international podcast now.
Woohoo!
Awesome.
Yes. I mean, we have had like a few listeners in Canada and a variety of other places, but
I believe that Emily Ann is our first international guest.
Yeah. Oh my
Jet
gosh.
set, you might say.
I've never even.
How exciting!
That's fun. International guests.
Yes, so I did a project working with the ELCIC National Church because they produce a series of bulletin covers every year that are pre-printed that local churches can order sets of those bulletins, and so the outside is pre-printed with that week's lectionary readings and some things like that. And then a church can then run their own text on the other side of it so that they can have the sort of personal thing of which hymns have been selected, etc. And so in those bulletins, there is always an image that goes along with the Bible readings. And so last year I was hired by the ELCIC to create those images. So I was able to go through all of the year A readings in advance and really think about them and generate images that would be thought-provoking about that week's text. And it was a really fun project to think of ways to take any particular week's Bible readings and draw it into images that would be familiar to people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful.
That's really cool. Yeah, I remember you doing it and seeing some of the different pictures that you were picking or like thinking about for different passages, and it was fun to be like able to see all of those and the connections that you were making.
Yeah, be sort of adjacent to that. It was interesting. Of course, that project ended up being slightly interrupted by COVID, because they did printing in half years. So they did the first half of year A, and all the churches ordered their physical bulletins because they were meeting in person. And then for the second half of the year, they ended up doing almost no print runs about it because nobody was meeting in person anymore. So
that makes sense and is disappointing in the realm of like the momentum of the project.
Sure. And I think that means that, for year B, they weren't really considering hiring a photographer to do that same kind of project again. I think it did make me really interested in the idea of doing that kind of thing, essentially to create almost a stock library of images for people to use in more, I don't know, less in-person physical times or whatever.
Actually, speaking of the richness of stories, I was going to say I do have a fictional reference for a description of what it's like to look at a particularly extraordinary color of black, which, now that I think about it, is a pretty weird sentence to say. But I really enjoy the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series by Douglas Adams, and at one point there is a spacecraft that they bump into, not literally, exactly, that is painted this extraordinary color of black. It's a stunt ship that belongs to a band called Disaster Area. And the way it's described, it is so extremely dark that it's hard to make out the shape against the backdrop of the blackness of space. It was almost impossible to tell how close you were standing to it, and the light seems to fall into it, and your eyes just want to slide off of it.
Ooh.
Most of us will probably never actually see Vantablack in the real world in person, but that is kind of how I imagine that experience feeling like. But if we do want to jump into the richness of the stories of the Bible in particular, instead of other nerdy stories, then yes, we can certainly jump into our first reading for today from 2 Kings, chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Elijah, knowing God will bring him to heaven that day, tries to convince Elisha to leave him, but Elisha refuses again and again. When it is finally time for Elijah to go, Elisha asks to inherit a double share of his spirit.
I would just like to point out before we get too far into this reminds me of like every parent who has ever named, I think mostly it's fictional, but like who has named their children who are twins names that are like Andrew
almost
and
identical.
Andrea. Yeah.
Yes.
Like I intentionally pronounce them.
Or sometimes it's just siblings that aren't actually twins.
Yeah.
But,
I intentionally pronounce Elijah and Elisha so that I can like distinguish them. But I don't think it's like proper pronunciation. I mean, I always tell people if you pronounce it with confidence, no one will know that you're not pronouncing it right, including probably most of the pastors. But
also, I had a classmate in seminary who was actually named Emily, come to think of it.
It's a good name.
Is still named Emily, last I checked. And she had a little sister whose name was Elisha. Spelled like the prophet in the Bible. So.
Nice. So for a theme for this passage, besides, mixing up names.
Yes.
As I was reading it, I couldn't help but think of the way that Elisha is just this relentless companion to Elijah, where Elijah's like, okay, stop. I'm going to keep going. And Elisha's like, okay, me too. And then Elijah's like, okay, stop. I'm going to keep going. And Elisha's like, okay, me too. And it reminded me vividly of the scene towards the end of Fellowship of the Rings in Lord of the Rings, where Frodo's like leaving everybody behind. And so he says to Sam, I'm going to Mordor alone. And Sam says, of course you are. And I'm coming with you. And it was just this like vivid imagery for me of like, yep, Elisha is the Samwise Gamgee of this story.
Yes, exactly. And I'm going to mentally see him that way for the rest of my life now, thanks to you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
But is he carrying a bag of potatoes, is my question.
It's the frying pan. It's all about the frying pan more than the potatoes.
Yes, that's...
Or the spices, the little box of spices that he drops.
So, in this passage, really throughout the first section of the passage, verses 1 through 8, Elisha gets to have exactly 2 lines. And he alternates them depending on who he's talking to. When he's talking to Elijah, he says, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you," over and over and over again. But in between talking to Elijah, when Elijah keeps trying to leave him behind, he's also talking to these various groups of prophets that pop up and greet them and try to point out to Elisha, "You know he's going to leave you today, right? You know he's leaving. Do you know he's leaving?" Every time somebody does this, Elisha says to them, "Yes, I know. Keep silent." And I always mentally hear him getting more and more irritated with every group as he does that. And so both of these lines are repeated over and over. And if I was Elisha, I would be convinced I was about to mix them up. Imagine him saying, "Yes, I know. Keep silent," to Elijah. I don't think that would go over very well.
Maybe not.
Or, for that matter, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you," to these random groups of prophets.
Who are like...
Wait, no, that's not what I meant to say. Hang on. And it reminded me of, there is actually a variety of videos on YouTube, although I have a personal favorite, of the Silent Monks Act performing the Hallelujah Chorus, which actually, come to think of it, I think would be a wonderful thing for churches to do on Easter Sunday. If you're doing video or in-person worship, this could be an excellent way to have the Hallelujah Chorus in your worship and not spread COVID. Yeah, without actually singing. You have a line of people, they don't actually have to be wearing monk's robes, it's just part of the bit. And each of them is holding a cue card, and there is one thing written on one side and one thing written on the other side. As the Hallelujah Chorus goes on, it's basically like 2 or 3 lines repeated over and over and over again, and so the cue cards spell out Hallelujah by syllable or the various other lines. And they have to show the correct side of the card at the correct time, or else the whole thing will get thrown off. And my personal favorite version of the video, which we will link to in the description, the very last monk is a lot shorter than all the others, and so he sometimes has to jump to hold his cue card up as high as everyone else when it's being especially loud, which is my favorite part. But it's a creative way of celebrating the Hallelujah Chorus without actually singing, and I appreciate it. But every time I watch the video, even when I'm watching the exact same one, I am always wondering to myself, is someone going to flip the cue card the wrong way? And it's much like Elisha saying these 2 lines over and over again, and apparently not getting mixed up and, telling Elijah to shut up. And I'm very impressed by that, so.
Yeah. I was thinking about, there's some movie or show or something where somebody's leaving or something like this, where they, know the thing is coming and they're not happy about it, and everybody keeps reminding them, and they're just like, "I know, shut up. Shut up. Shut up."
I'm sure there's gotta be.
But I can't I couldn't think of, what it was.
I feel like that's a question to answer on TV tropes, but, once you go on TV tropes, you lose 8 hours of your life.
That is a fairly high cost.
I've never been.
Good luck.
Yeah, I've never been on TV tropes. I don't think it's worth 8 hours. But if any of you want to go, dear listeners, want to go on TV tropes and tell me what TV trope/show I'm thinking about, let us know.
That would be great.
We'll give you a shout out next time we record, after you tell us, which will be probably, I don't know, Easter.
And then you can tell Emily what fun that website is.
Or how much of your time you lost of your life.
I'm sorry, you've seen the Lord of the Rings movies how many times?
That's not lost life. That's lived life. Seriously.
Sure, and if anyone goes and loses 8 hours on TV tropes, we can find out whether they perceive that as lost life or lived life.
Yes.
Exactly.
Maybe they will have learned something new.
I mean, hopefully, where this TV trope comes from.
Yes.
I was looking at this episode, and when I was thinking about Elijah ascending in a whirlwind into heaven, the image that came to mind for me was Mary Poppins, because she travels in the wind. And so, it was also partly because I was trying to figure out what movie or TV show the trope was from, and so I was typing "shut up" GIFs, and Mary Poppins somehow came up. But there's the thing of her Paul walking out the door, putting up her umbrella, and then just like ascending into heaven, ascending into the clouds in a whirlwind. This feels a lot queerer, but...
Because of the flaming horses?
I think the only way that Mary Poppins... Yeah.
Yes, the flaming horses.
The only way that Mary Poppins could be more awesome is if she had a flaming chariot with flaming horses. That would be fantastic.
That would be a really different tone of thing happening there. It doesn't have quite that, like...
that would be Mary Poppins when she goes and visits the bad
Or it just feels like, I don't know, Mary Poppins is like such a, like, prim British kind of thing. And so to introduce the, like, horses and everything just feels like it's, you know, maybe it's also a decolonialized version of what Mary Poppins could be. So, like,
right.
I'm open to it.
I'm here for
Yes.
it. Yeah.
I love it.
When you said flaming horses, like, well, she does have, like, the chariots, but those are carousel horses, aren't they? Yeah, I would be down for a decolonized Mary Poppins.
I haven't actually seen Mary Poppins Returns, but I don't think we ever really get to see her truly pissed off, and I kind of want to, just to see what it's like, because she has that personality of, she's very prim and proper, but it feels like she has a very forceful personality behind that, and I kind of want to see that.
Oh, sure, she's definitely stern at times, but you don't really get her angry.
Yeah. Our second reading for Transfiguration Sunday is 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 3 through 6. While the world would have us focus inward on ourselves, we remain focused on the good news of Jesus Christ. So one of the themes in this passage is language and the power of words. So mostly I noticed it because I was like, well, that's problematic, and that's problematic. Words have power. We know this from any magical thing ever where there are spells made of words and they make things happen. But I noticed it for 2 Corinthians because Paul is using blindness as a metaphor for not being able to, like, in verse 4 he says, in their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers, which, like, doesn't quite make sense anyway, because brains don't have eyes, but...
Well, now they do in my head. Thank you. I needed that mental image.
You're welcome. Just think of brains as angels.
I was going to say, it just reminds me of all the angel
eyes.
imagery of all the eyes, but just with a brain in the middle.
Oh, goodness.
Perfect.
That's fantastic. Yeah, so Paul's, like, aside from the fact of, like, what he's actually saying doesn't quite make sense, but the idea that blindness is... Like, yes, blindness means you cannot visually see. And so frequently, the way that ableism works in this sort of metaphor is that, like, the disability is the negative thing. When in reality, there's a lot of ways in which people who are blind are actually more aware of things in the world and things going on than people who are not, because they have to be. Partly because they have to be in order to survive. But then... the other half of that was, right, the language that Paul uses about light shining out of darkness and connecting God's presence with light, which we hear a lot in Advent. We hear it in Epiphany, which is the season that we're just finishing up, right? But this idea that, like, lightness is good and darkness is bad. And in our particular context, especially in North America, I think especially in the United States, but probably also in Canada,
For sure.
Yep, the impact of racism on those valuations and the ways that white people get associated with lightness and therefore with God and goodness, and particularly Black people, but Black Indigenous people of color get associated with darkness and badness and not God in ways that are really problematic and harmful for all of us. So Paul clearly doesn't know that words have power. I mean, he does. He writes letters all the time. You should know better.
Right. Actually, that does remind me of, I think it was a speaker who came to my elementary school when I was a kid. They were discussing the experience of what it's like to be blind, and we had never really thought about it, but I guess all of the children had imagined that if you were blind, that basically meant you saw black 24 hours a day and nothing else. But they were explaining that no, that's not actually what blindness is like. It's not that you see black because you don't see anything. And I guess this particular visitor had sight at some point in their life and became blind over time. And the way they described it was, you know how sometimes if you're about to faint, your vision goes kind of gray at the edges?
Mm-hmm.
And they said it was really more along the lines of kind of like that grayness, but it's just all that gray instead of... So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I definitely fall in that trap of it's just dark all the time, which I know is not true, but like it's hard.
Right.
It's the things that we can't imagine until we've experienced them or seen them.
It's the opposite of trying to explain a color to a blind person, is trying to explain what being blind like is to a sighted person.
It's like black. We can't imagine the blackest of black without actually seeing it because our brains are so used to like still being able to see shapes.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
When we reach verse 5, we hear, "For we do not proclaim ourselves, we proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord." And anytime you see a preacher or a religious leader, specifically in Christianity, although I suppose this probably happens in other religions too, but anytime you start seeing them start to focus on proclaiming themselves too much, that's a danger signal. That can go some very odd and quirky and sometimes horrific places. Those of you who know of my love of the movie Saved, that came out about 20 years ago.
Oh my gosh, was that 20 years ago?
Actually, yes.
It came out when I was in college.
No, not 20 years ago. No, yep.
Almost.
That's about
We're getting
the
there.
age I was at.
Yep. Thanks for that.
If you needed a reminder that you're old, or that you're young for the folks listening to this who, weren't alive then, we love you too.
It's a classic. I'm here for Saved becoming a classic.
Absolutely.
I want to watch this with every youth group I ever have for the rest of my life.
That's where I first watched it.
The parents of it is a whole separate thing. Oh, that's fantastic. But yes, so the pastor in that movie finds this out at one point in the movie. In real life, there are, goodness knows, many, many examples. I'm thinking of a lot of televangelist names, but I don't want to get sued. But most recently, perhaps, if you followed the story from the Pacific Northwest, there was a pastor named Mark Driscoll who learned this lesson with some enthusiasm, you might say.
What lesson?
Of not proclaiming himself too much as opposed to proclaiming Jesus.
I know nothing about Mark Driscoll.
He ran a mega church called
Mars
was
Hill.
it Mars Hill?
That's right.
Yeah,
Oh.
and super misogynistic, really conservative in some ways, very into complementary gender roles. And he ran the show. He was the star preacher. He was the star of the show. And then he kept having this series of scandals, and they kept getting worse. And eventually he had to step down and had to be convinced to step. And it's a whole big mess.
Gotcha.
And then I believe he wandered off and started another church, if I remember correctly, but I might be wrong on that.
Interestingly, this also came to a head in 2014, which is the same year that the Anish Kapoor controversy happened.
Oh, yeah, come to think of it.
So.
2014.
That would have been about right.
The year of the controversies, before every day was a controversy.
I'm not sure that it...
Yeah, I'm
not sure that it actually was before every day was a
well,
controversy, so much as... we might not have been aware of all the controversies that were happening every day.
Fair.
The reason that I knew his name was because he was one of the people that was cited when people were trying to convince me that I shouldn't be a pastor because I have ovaries. So.
Good point.
I did not get that message. I mean, I kind of got that message, but not explicitly.
He and John Piper were the two big ones. Yeah.
I now am so immersed in the queer church world, by the way, that I sometimes legitimately forget that straight people and men can be pastors. I get confused.
I wish I had that problem.
Yeah, no, I understand that, not being clergy myself, I probably, I have a particular way of being in my own little bubble about that. But last year during gardening season, one of my roommates was complaining about a weed in our garden that's colloquially called bishop's beard. And I was legit confused. I was I guess some bishops have beards, but it's just not common enough that why would a plant end up getting called that? It legitimately took me a few minutes to understand that was actually much more common. And
that's fantastic. In verse 6, Paul says, "For it is the God who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' who has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ." And as I mentioned earlier, there is stuff in this sentence that is problematic. They are clearly not talking about black holes or the fancy black Vanta paint that Emily was talking about earlier, because there was no light shining out of those things. And they are too beautifully black to have any light shining out of them, really. I mean, I can't speak for the paint exactly because I haven't really seen it, but I love black holes, so...
I mean, honestly, the paint is... some like the Vantablack paint actually does work in some way similar to a black hole, because I had mentioned the thing about how it's like based on a nanotube concept, and it is actually that it's like manages to capture light that's coming into it so that whatever light is reflecting is actually reflecting around in the nanotubes inside of it, and it eventually gets converted to heat as a way of expelling it, because the light actually has no way of escaping the blackness of the paint. So
it is like the black hole of paints.
Yeah, it sort of is.
So exciting.
So now you understand why we were so irritated by Anish Kapoor, because he's keeping it all for himself.
Rude.
Our gospel reading for Transfiguration Sunday is from Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 9. Jesus is transfigured on a mountaintop before Peter, James, and John, and Moses and Elijah appear and speak to Jesus. Returning to the others, Jesus tells those with him not to tell this story until after the human one rises from the dead.
So one of the most obvious themes for this passage is change, aka transfiguration. I know, I think it's like an obligation as a trans person, and that transfiguration has to be about Jesus being trans. But I do think that there's an aspect, I love the idea of connecting this to transgender people and to Jesus being trans, because I'm trans and I'm a pastor and that's what I like to do. But I also think that there's a unique aspect of it where, right, Jesus is changed, visibly changed for this particular small group of Peter, James, and John. There is a shift that happens. There's a shift that happens between like what God has said at baptism of this is my child, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased, to this is my child, the beloved, listen to them. And so there's this like shift. There's this clear change that happens. And yet, as Jesus goes back down the mountain, he says, like, don't tell anybody about this. And nobody notices the change. And I think there's an aspect of being trans that is this, like, the moments of realization about, like, the moments that I've had of, and they've been, like, kind of slow moments, not necessarily a mountaintop experience, but the moments of recognizing a change about myself, or recognizing that I'm not a new way of understanding myself. And yet, to folks like outside of that, like I look exactly the same. Like I don't look different. They don't necessarily notice that change, and yet it's still there.
Right.
So Jesus is trans. This is evidence number, 432.
I would love to receive that whole list sometime. Not because I don't believe you, but just because like I'd be delighted to, investigate them and just like get in there with it,
Right? Like the main initial evidence is, Mary and the Holy Spirit and how we talk about them both.
Sure.
But yeah, there's more than that.
I was also going to say that since this passage is primarily about change, as you said, that might explain why Lutherans tend to be kind of uncomfortable with it. Lutherans are not known for being comfortable with change. How many Lutherans does it take to change a light bulb? Yeah.
I mean, denominationally, that feels way more accurate than I want it to be.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I agree with that.
We're good at a lot,
I do feel like I think that's real, and I don't want to give too much credit to other institutional church bodies for being like so nimble and flexible either, because that's not quite
right.
been the experience about those either.
That's not really what any denomination is known for, I think.
Right.
That's fair.
As we dive into the passage, in verse 7, we hear that a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, and it made me think of Storm from X-Men, that she was probably there hanging out, and like, I don't know, maybe she was behind the tree or something, but the author probably just forgot to write her name down because, she's a woman and they don't like to write women's names down unless they absolutely have to. But I think Storm was there making the
and may have at the time resembled Halle Berry,
I think that'd be a pretty accurate representation. Maybe God is Storm, or Storm is God. Okay, I know I'm the one that always says don't make actual characters actual God or actual Jesus, but I like the idea of Storm as God or God as Storm. I think it'd be fun.
Well, no, we know who the Storm is. The oncoming Storm is the Doctor.
Oh, here we go. This is getting into quite the crossover universe event here.
That will be Doctor number, 15 or something.
Mm-hmm.
I'm up for it. It would be a great show.
It's true.
I feel like maybe
that would be amazing.
Maybe you two need to get an additional person on your team that can be a comic artist, so that you could actually create a comic strip of the biblical readings that you're diving into, and actually build in some of these pieces of it.
And the very weird
crossovers.
I do know the person who does the revised comic lectionary. I don't know that he's been doing a lot lately, but I do know him. We're Facebook friends.
Interesting.
You might also be able to do it, depending on the style that you would want to go for, you might be able to do it with friends who are very good at meme creation. Because if you're doing more of a style that's about digital collage and pulling together different pieces, then, that might also be available. And
True.
One of the ways that you can come up with images for your podcast promotions.
Yes, this is brilliant. If you're interested in volunteering for this work, let us know. No promises that we'll pick you, but,
We are certainly interested in having you audition. That would be a good time. And probably definitely lift our spirits during, COVID.
Oh my gosh, that would be fantastic. I just want to say, most of our meme people are, have been or will be guests on our podcast.
In verse 8, we hear, "Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus." The trouble with mountaintop experiences, of course, is that they end. And what do you do then? This moment reminds me very much to jump into a slightly different type of nerdiness than we have been in for most of the episode. This reminds me very much of the way that the Fae or fairy realm are described in the child ballads. There was a man named Francis James Child in the 19th century who collected a variety of ballads, often focused around the Fae or fairy legends of, I believe, mostly Britain and the United Kingdom. Not that it was the United Kingdom then, my history on that is fuzzy. But the child ballads are a very much not American pop culture look at what the fairy world would look like. It's pretty dark. They're kind of sociopathic. It's kind of creepy. And it's a very vivid universe, kind of, described by these ballads, and the stories written based on the ballads later. It's sort of a genre of its own. And this moment where they look around, and they had been having this extraordinary experience, and suddenly they look around, and it's just them, and there's nothing extraordinary at all. That feeling of sort of suddenly being without, suddenly bereft. There we go. They're feeling kind of bereft.
Word.
I like that word. That feeling very much is a part of those ballads. So,
See, when you were talking about Fae, I was just going to the books I'm reading, the Ember and the Ashes series, because Fae creatures come up all the time.
Yes, I actually just finished the first book of Shannon McGuire's October Day series, which I think I've mentioned in a recent episode, and that is also based on that world, but her version of the fairy world is more child-inspired than the more warm and fuzzy American pop culture version.
So my thought about mountaintop moments is a little bit less like Fae in origin, but I think it's interesting to think of that moment about sort of the bereftness of the moment being over, because when I think of mountaintop moments, I mostly think of Jesus sending out everybody from Mount Olivet, and I mostly think about that particular moment because the church community that I worship with here in Vancouver, that my partner is the pastor for, is Mount Olivet, and so we do talk about that particular moment, and we have some church art and stuff that's based on that thing, and the idea that a mountaintop moment is designed to, of course, end, and that there is something after that, and that is the going out, the going forth and carrying that story and that experience forward. And it just, of course, having that moment be over has that feeling, and I think that using the word bereft is very evocative of what that experience is like. And I think that it's just there's also a lot of energy for me in that next part of going forth with it afterwards.
Yeah.
I actually, when you were talking, Emily, I was thinking about that moment, and like for Jesus, this is now it's time to go to Jerusalem. Like this is a heading to Jerusalem. That's the direction that he goes down the mountain, is down the mountain and off to Jerusalem.
To die.
You know, but I was thinking about, so I am from Colorado and from the mountains of Colorado, and it just snowed magnificently here in Iowa the last couple of days, and I had to go dig out my car so that I could move it so that they could plow the parking lot, so that I can move it again so that they can plow the parking lot again tomorrow in a different spot. But
yeah,
I miss snow so much that I got my snow boots on, snow pants, snow boots, jacket, snow gloves, hat, all of the things, and then I went and got my mail, and after I had shoveled out my car, and then there's just these big piles of snow, and so I thought about climbing on top and trying to sled down, but they were piles of snow from snow plows, so I was I don't know that I trust them that much, so I just went and laid down on them. That is a totally unnecessary part of the story, but that's what I did this morning. But when I think about mountaintop experiences, for most of my life, the mountaintop was where it began, right? It's you ride up the chairlift and get off and then ski down.
Right.
Or snowboard down or whatever. And so there was one time with our Nordic cross-country ski team that we skied up the mountain to the top of Mountaintop Express, which is a whole other experience, and you should not plan on getting there at sunset when the gondola to take you down is closed. But that's a minor detail. We were in high school. High schoolers don't make the best decisions. But I do think...
Really?
But it is that sense of mountaintop experience. I've never thought of it this way until you had mentioned it, Emily, of that it's the going out. And then I was oh yeah, mountaintop experience for me is from a snowboarding experience is you get to the top and the adventure begins.
Right, absolutely.
As you go down.
Yeah, that tracks.
Yeah. See, I'm also hearing from this that for you a mountaintop experience has to involve snow.
Obviously.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus' clothes.
Jesus was dressed in snow?
I mean, it says...
Jesus the snowman?
It says Jesus was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. Which, actually, I don't think I actually made this a connection explicit, but part of why we had Emily on in the first place was because I was thinking about this passage, and we have such efficient bleach these days that, we can actually bleach things pretty easily and get it pretty dazzling white. But what's harder to do is to keep the black clothes. And Emily, you mentioned this when you were talking about going to match blacks, right? It's really hard to keep black clothes actually black. And so if we were thinking about the amazingness of this transfiguration, part of it was in the impossibility and the difficulty of having something be that white. And I think today it is that impossibility, that difficulty of having something be that completely black. So I think it actually would make more sense if we thought about it as Vantablack clothes.
And I think it's also the case that probably at this particular biblical time, it probably also would have been impossible to make things that deep of a dazzling black also.
Sure.
Although now one of them is, obviously harder than the other one.
Yeah.
But living in a desert, you wouldn't want to be wearing something that black.
Sure.
Also true.
Absolutely. That sounds...
That would be a little warm.
Very uncomfortable.
Especially because the nanotubes are then just going to turn all of that light into heat. So all of the absorption of the light as heat and...
But you would look
extra heat.
So good.
Right? So good.
People wouldn't be able to perceive wouldn't be able to perceive you, and that has some interesting possibilities, right? They couldn't actually understand
that would be amazing.
Your shape and what's happening,
Bible ninjas.
That could be amazing. I think that could be such a gift though, also for people with any sort of body dysphoria, that if I could wear clothing that was just like so completely black. I wouldn't have to deal with like the assumptions people make when they see the shape of my body.
Absolutely.
Just be a body. This is amazing.
You could have your gender presentation be black hole.
Yes! That is my new goal in life.
The Twitter account that says today's gender presentation
today's gender is black hole. They actually sometimes do have black hole as an option. It's like something more than just like black hole, but yes.
Right.
So, Emily, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've been, contemplating it as we've gone through the thing, but I think we've really touched on most of the things I had hoped to talk about. So I think I am interested after this conversation and going and playing with ultra pigmented paints. And maybe my last thought is that I would really encourage people to do that too, because it is a really fascinating way of understanding light and color and how we get tied up in some of these ideas of what are good colors and bad colors and what it all means. And you definitely don't have to have any kind of art credentials to just play with it.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. And
thanks for joining
you
us.
had mentioned your fluid art and you mentioned photography on your website, which we'll link to. Do you have like pictures so people can see what that looks like, or what? I know you kind of described some of the fluid, particularly the fluid art
stuff. Yeah, my website is mostly focused on photography and a little bit of graphic design stuff right now, and some other projects I work on. I work on a very wide variety of projects, and so don't necessarily have a very robust web presence for every single one of them. But my website does link to my more professional Instagram feed, and that one does have some more of the fluid art projects that I do.
Cool. Nice. Thanks for joining us, and thank you for joining us, Emily Ann. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for Ash Wednesday with our special guest, Crystal Cheatham of the Our Bible app. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you appreciate what we do or want to get actual transcripts of the podcast episodes, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that. Though if you want to help us with transcripts, or if you have ideas about the TV trope that I was asking about earlier, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christian said,
Pax
vobiscum.
vobiscum.